We could start. Hi, I am Amel Akremi from Tunisia, from the Ministry of Environment, and I'm taking the floor to welcome you all. I'm happy to see this many people attending our event, even though it is a lunchtime, and even though the subject is a little bit itchy for some of us. Tunisia, you are wondering why Tunisia is discussing or even organizing an event on this subject. It is a good question. We are wondering why we did it. But the subject is very interesting, and we have a belief for a lot of us, even though we are from a developing country, that the subject needs to be dealt with in a different manner. We had the experience with the CDM, with a mechanism, flexible mechanism of Kyoto Protocol, and a lot of us had problems. We believe that with the Paris Agreement, things could move differently, and we have to consider them in a different way. I'm not going to talk technical things, technical aspects. I will leave that to Matthias. It's his area of expertise. I am going to talk about this Article 6 and what it means to us, to all of us, especially my country, Tunisia. And you see, Ethiopia is here with us. And as the panel is different, it's from different countries, different level of development, it means that the subject is very important to all of us. The article deals with different approaches. I'm not going to talk about mechanism. The only mechanism that is mentioned in 6.2 is a mechanism to mitigate emissions while considering sustainable development. Some of us would like to consider it as a SDM, as a mechanism for sustainable development. But when you read the article, it is not mentioned this way. But we would like to consider it as a SDM. The ITMOS, it's an itchy word for a lot of us. ITMOS means that emission trading systems are in place. When we would like to exchange, do we need to have an ETS in our countries? If you would like to have, if we are willing to have a voluntary voluntary actions in our countries, do we need to establish an ETS? A question that needs to be answered. The other approaches, we don't have any problem with that, especially that it is mentioned that they deal with sustainable development, they combat poverty, they try to reduce poverty. Some other aspects that are dear to us, like adaptation, are considered in 6.8. All of us, we have to have a brainstorming on this subject. With your help, I'm sure that we will be bringing some light to these aspects. I don't want to be longer than that. I'll tell Matthias, take the floor. Thank you, Matthias. Merci.
Thank you, Amel. Is this working? Yeah, very good. Thank you very much for your kind words of introduction to this side event hosted by Tunisia. I'm very happy to give a few key points on the core elements of the questions that we have ahead based on basically the text of the Paris Agreement, which might give us some sorts of a core for this discussion afterwards to establish jointly maybe something like a vision for market mechanisms to go ahead. It is my pleasure to introduce the three speakers that we have today with us. Like Amel mentioned, speakers from different countries that will share their views on where we stand and what needs to be done in the negotiations and outside of them in the real world as well. We will hear first from Thomas Fort from the German Environment Ministry, BMUB. Thomas Fort is well known to those in the carbon market realm, having championed since long the use of the clean development mechanisms in the immediate times, as well as using its core structures. I believe that's your view for going forward in elaborating further markets as we go along. And I think it's fair to say that Thomas Fort has a pretty specific perspective already on where we could be going, hopefully. He will be followed by a presentation by Mulugeta Mengistia Ayale. I hope I said your name fairly okay. He works at the Office of the Prime Minister of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, and he's in charge, being the Director of Climate Change Affairs. Ethiopia has also been a very strong pioneer in market aspects of climate negotiations and in climate negotiations overall, a very good champion of urgent action. And he will share some insights from Ethiopia with regard to carbon markets. And then finally, we have Afef Jafar from the Agence Nationale de la Maîtrise de l'Énergie, or the National Agency of Energy Conservation and Renewable Energy in Tunisia. She is the responsible for the CDM implementation and has worked also in particular on the maybe one of the world's first projects on sector-wide mitigation action potentially through crediting in the cement sector of Tunisia. And of course, you will share some insights of Tunisia's perspective on markets. And with that, I'd like to give you, as promised, a few bullet points, so to speak, that will maybe frame our discussion or help us find our way around the Paris Agreement text. Okay. So basically, the new thing is that after Paris, all countries can participate, and there's no longer this clear divide between Annex 1 and non-Annex 1. And we see in Article 6.4, and I try to stick to the text, to the facts as much as possible, but I still inserted the SDM acronym there, which is of course subject to debate. Maybe that sparks a debate here as well, which combines features of the CDM and the JI, which is clearly there in the structure that is given through the Paris Agreement text, namely that it should be supervised by a central oversight body, something that could resemble the executive board of the CDM, that there's a payment of an adaptation levy included, that public and private entities that participate should be authorized by the national governments, that there should be a clear allocation of the credits to buyers or sellers to prevent double counting, that this mechanism established in Article 6.4 should also deliver an overall mitigation of global emissions, a concept which is itself subject to further clarification, I believe, and maybe we'll hear something about that as well. And the next steps are basically on the formal side, that the conference of the parties serving as the meetings to the agreement are to develop or adopt rather rules for this mechanism. And these rules should build on the principles which very much resemble, of course, the principles of the Kyoto mechanisms, that these emissions reductions should be real, measurable, and long-term. And there should be a definition of the scope of these activities, so that it's clear which types of activities may or may not be included. There should be additionality given in these mitigation actions, that they're not just business as usual. And finally, that these also need to be verified and certified. And something quite interesting is that the Paris Agreement actually states explicitly that we should be looking at the Kyoto mechanisms for lessons. Of course, there's also the cooperative approaches, a broader, maybe more flexible term defined in Article 6.2 and 6.3. But there again, I think the range of questions is even broader. We don't have these clear expectations, maybe in some cases, for the article established in, for the mechanism established in Article 6.4. But these concepts can span much broader actions that are already taking place in some way or another and may or may not be viewed as part of Article 6.2. And it is, of course, possible that parties may already make use of these Article 6.2 mechanism or range of instruments even before 2020, which is, of course, an interesting option if there is a willingness to go ahead and provide some early action. And of course, the question here is, how can guidance that will need to be adopted by the CMA, how can guidance provide sufficient clarity so that we have environmental integrity and transparency in this mechanism? And there is not, unlike in the other mechanism, there is not a clear allocation of responsibility for oversight. And so the question really is, how will parties choose to make use of this very broad term? And with this very brief and maybe a bit technical overview, I would like to give the floor to Thomas Fort, who will share vision, hopefully.
So, thank you very much for the invitation to speak here on a Tunisian side event. I'm very lucky that Tunisia is so engaged in this international discussion also, and trying to implement things in the near future, I hope, which is necessary to make a vision of the carbon market in the next decade real life. There, we tried it under the CDM, and it comes very late for this purpose, but we think that it will fit under 6.4, and this is maybe a discussion we can take off after I have presented here. I hope so. Matthias, I think this is an early stage to speak about a vision or give some clearance. I think we, could you go a little bit with my presentation? Because it's very early to speak about visions. It's a time where it's not really clear what are the visions could be. Up to what we are regulating under here the UNFCCC, and we have seen that there are different functions we have to fulfill for the Article 6.2, 6.4, maybe 6.8, and Matthias mentioned this already. But for me, it starts the discussion about the markets with the overall function, which we have with Article 6 in the Paris Agreement. It's much more. We have to see that many activities in preparation of the Paris Agreement has been directed to domestic actions to make clear how countries could work together on the basis of their own contributions to overcome the differentiation between Annex 1 and non-Annex 1. I think this is managed by the Paris Agreement very well, and for the market it means we have seller and buyers maybe on other sides as before. Maybe countries like China will come to be sellers and buyers at the same time, maybe Brazil, and maybe also European countries have thought about being a buyer of certificates under the joint implementation mechanism for several years. And why not doing this internally in the EU is also a target, but we can do it also maybe under Article 6. That's a challenge for all countries, and that's good because we would like to see cooperation worldwide in addition to national activities. So that's the voluntary basis to go further. In addition, supplemental, however you call it, additionality is not the right word for this, but supplemental to your own action. And we have different capabilities which we can share. We have different resources which we can bring together. And therefore, it's really needed to bring in the cooperative approaches as a whole under Article 6 in the overall aims of the Paris Agreement. And I think we have to make a differentiation between things which could reach unconditionally by countries and which are defined as conditional when a country goes to say, we would like to use these mechanisms to reach something more, then it's a very important point because this is one type of NDC we have to handle now. We have to arrange now for the accounting of national activities. And this is also where we're speaking about the accounting rules in this area, which is not really defined under Article 6, but under other articles and several pages, especially the transparency thing is necessary to reflect. But this is not all. We have not only the world of NDCs with conditionalities and unconditionalities, we have also to see that these NDCs have blanks. There are a lot of things not regulated in the national territories. So we have three types. And sometimes people are discussing when we are going to the not defined sectors of the NDCs, that would be the same like under the CDM, a kind of black box. Because of this, we have also to speak whether the activity done between two or several countries is performed under Article 6, how to safeguard these activities against the national targets and how to declare what it's to share between the countries. And maybe there's something to share because we have tried to bring the flexibility which we have seen under the KP for Annex 1 countries, for all countries. So if Tunisia, as example, would like to reach something conditionally, then it's clear that at the same time these certificates has to be part of their NDCs and not to, transit the borders. So that is a challenge how these things could be financed. Maybe at the end, we have to reflect a sharing point in this whole mitigation outcomes. Maybe not, it depends whether we are going for the use of these certificates for Tunisia or for more ambition in other countries. And if we are not able to use these certificates as ITMOs internationally, maybe this is not a pity because we can speak about it as a means of implementation with climate finance. That is also an option we should have in our mind because Article 6 is not only about the market mechanism, it's a broader cooperation. We can use the other areas which are means of implementation. And so it's a question how we would work together. Maybe there is an interest for countries like Germany to get some certificates, maybe not, because we are trying to get a really ambitious target for Germany. We discussed 40% since a long time for 2020 and not for 2030, and we are going until more than 50%, 55. It's not formally decided, but in the plans. So this is a lot of more. And for this thing, maybe we could use certificates, but we could say also we reach this domestically and define also a certain portion of international activities under climate finance. This is political spoken, not decided how we can do it because we have to separate market activities and the ITMO transfer from our accounting for climate finance. It's a political question which is not solved, and maybe it's really too early to speak about this, but this is a chance for cooperation to bring both things together. And the real reason to doing this is clear that we have to define how these conditional NDCs are accounted. And if we have solved this, then we can have a better picture about this, whether we could use climate finance or markets. So this is open. I think the next slide I've prepared is something similar, but smaller than Matthias has already presented. For me, Article 6.1 is very crucial. For all activities we could do under Article 6, the umbrella function for higher ambition is the point where we integrated to the global stocktake for the NDCs. That's a very important point. There is no link in the Paris Agreement for the stock taking, but it's clear. If you go for this NDC upgrade from time to time, then you have to ask which activities are still additional for a country, and therefore it's possible to perform it further under the Article 6, but sometimes the transition processes runs very quick. And then it's a question whether it will be put under the NDC of the host country. Good examples in the history are China, where the markets for solar energy emerged, for wind energy emerged, and so on. So you can expect that we will intensify our cooperation and spread technologies worldwide under the tech mechanism. Maybe there are also chances that transition in countries in the sectors runs quicker than under the CDM. Maybe we have to speak about the incentives that it will be possible to do so. And in my view, it's clear if this is not reached, then we have a chance to use further Article 6. So long it's not really in the business as usual scenario of a country, then it's additional. So this has to be in mind when we speak about Article 6.4 again, and the rules, modalities, and procedures, which is foreseen to be regulated here in hopefully in the next 2 years, will create these questions with parameters, maybe with standardization processes, so that we will see a different instrumental set of tools, not comparable to the CDM. I think it must be very clear that the CDM will get to an end also from the practical side, because nobody is really lucky about the complicated process. And the good chance is to have more standardization, more standardized baselines, maybe benchmarks, and so on, so that at this point it's very easy that countries and companies are able to calculate it before they start the activity. This is a very important point. It will change the role of the governance structure of the CDM. It makes it not weaker, but easier to decide on projects, programs, or more aggregated things, maybe on the sectoral level or on the programmatic level. That's possible. And for me, the very important point is for Article 6.4, this Article 6.5, there is something in which should be read as avoidance of double counting, but for me it's more. There is very clear stated that accounting for host countries is possible, and from a certain point it's possible to get these certificates for using for compliance, maybe in Germany, the EU, also in the US. So this point of differentiation is really the point of accounting, avoidance of double counting, and especially for the use of these cooperating countries. So we can think it from the end, not only from the technical point. And for me, this is a chance to speak very early. Matthias mentioned it already now. Article 6.2, that is already presented by Matthias. I would only give one addition. That the regulation we find in the decisions and in the Paris Agreement make a difference between the first NDC period and the second period. So we have to discuss which parties are ready to avoid double counting and account these activities correctly also in the first phase. I think for Germany, when we use Article 6.2, we would say it's a prerequisite for our programs to have this accounting. And I think that's clear. that it's not allow for double counting. And my last slide is on some challenges we will see, not only for the new mechanism, but for the restart of carbon market. There are challenges with the CDM. We have the question whether regulations, governance structures, and of course the project activities can be put under the Paris Agreement, or could they perform further? This is an important discussion because we see a lot of activities which are absolutely serious, which avoid emissions. And it's, in my view, not a good solution to say we have only a clear cut and restart with the Paris Agreement and neglect what we have reached under the Kyoto Protocol. These are gigatons which are able for the, not only for the markets to make profits and benefits, but it's real emission reductions, and we have to think about it. And maybe this is easier when we see an early start of Article 6 mechanism. Then we could better speak how this transition process could be performed. In the moment, what we could say is, okay, please go with your CDM activities for application under Article 6.4 or 6.2, and let's make a new process for these activities. Whether transformation of these activities has to be done under the new rules, it's clear, but maybe the way to get this acceptance is to speak about it, not to go again for 1 year, 1.5 years, with unclear rules, with new bodies for acceptance. This is something which should be avoided. The very last point would be ICAO, but I think it is clear this is a chance not for today, even if we have seen it in the media in the last weeks that there is something coming, maybe a demand up to how much? 5 gigatons up to 2035. That's good for the markets. Maybe this is a good chance also for the existing CDM projects, it's clear. But we have to reflect under the Paris Agreement how countries could provide in comparison to their NDCs, what they could deliver for this ICAO system, what they are ready to give up. The cheapest certificates which they need for their own NDCs, or has it been very clear that it should be helpful for reaching the NDCs, and then you could neglect the aspect that these certificates are going outside. And the other point is they should never come back to the Paris Agreement. So they should be registered there and cancelled there under the ICAO system. And this has to be developed in the next 18 months, I think, under ICAO. The timeline is very tight, but full of issues. So it's an important process for restarting the market, but it's not under our control. We can provide from our countries with our NDCs that these things could be used for ICAO and help us to reach our NDCs, especially in countries which would like to provide this offsetting chance. And this last point make again clear that the NDCs are absolutely crucial, where host countries could define how they cooperate and what they are offering for these countries. This is a very important process which is undefined in the moment, and we have to do some thinking about it. So it's not a real vision to get a broad market like we have seen it under the CDM. We have to work on the basics, and I hope then with the NDCs we will create a market based on the needs of the host countries and not based on the needs of have a cheaper compliance as we have seen under the Kyoto Protocol. And my final word is, if you look at Europe, we have done a lot in the KP, but in the moment we have problems to restart our ETS for being in compliance with the 1.5 degree pathways. It's far away from our thinking now. 2 degrees are in the discussions. 1.5, which we say on the Sunday speeches, is necessary. We have to build our instruments again, and that will take time, and maybe this is a discussion for the global stocktake we have to face also in Europe. And in the moment, we are not there. So restarting the market and have a vision now already where crucial things are not decided, it's for me too early, but I hope I could contribute for the points which we have to clarify in the near future.
Yeah, thank you very much, Thomas. I would like to encourage any questions on content, just for clarification. We can have a discussion afterwards in detail. If there are any content-related questions at this point. If not, I will give the floor to Muluketa Mingiste Ayala. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, inviting us to share our perspectives on the issues under consideration. And secondly, I would like to give you a background for promoting the use of market mechanisms for some time now. As you all remember, following the Copenhagen Conference of the Parties, the Secretary General to the United Nations has established a high-level advisory group on long-term financing. Ethiopia co-chaired that high-level advisory group. And from the conclusions, you remember that the conclusion of that high-level advisory group was that it was possible, it is challenging, but possible to mobilize 100 billion USD. And it identifies a number of sources to that effect. And many of those sources relate to market mechanisms. And that is one point as to how we relate to market mechanisms. And secondly, when we were in Durban and when we were promoting the second commitment period of the Durban, second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol, one of our reasons was we wanted to preserve the infrastructure established within the Kyoto Protocol, particularly as far as CDM is concerned, and because we recognize the value of market mechanisms. And Ethiopia is a member of the carbon pricing panel. Again, it's an initiative by the World Bank. Our Prime Minister is a member, and through that panel, we promote the use of carbon pricing mechanisms. At the moment, we are investigating the potential role of carbon pricing policies in low-income countries such as Ethiopia, the domestic use of carbon pricing policies. When we adopted our green growth climate resilient strategy in 2011, we recognized the financial difficulty or the difficulty of financing such an ambitious national policy. But at the same time, we also considered that we could tap into any market mechanisms, international market mechanisms, to access finance and to implement our national policies. And last year, when we communicated our national determined contribution, we also made it clear that we intend to use international market mechanisms or regional market mechanisms. Again, to give you a context, Ethiopia, in its nationally determined contribution, has said that it will reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 64% from business as usual by 2030. And we are expecting to use any market mechanisms established either internationally or nationally, and which we could access. Having said that as a background, let me share our perspectives on issues relating to Article 6, particularly those provisions relating to the market mechanisms. First is the issue of environmental integrity. I think we've been talking about this for a long time. By environmental integrity, we are talking about the fact that market mechanisms, whether established internationally or established nationally, should help in making real reductions of emissions, the concern to avoid double counting, and so on. This issue of double counting and environmental integrity will become problematic as a result of the Paris Agreement, because as opposed to the Kyoto Protocol, now there is no distinction between buyers and purchasers, purchasers and sellers, if I use those terms, because we are talking about market mechanisms. In the Kyoto Protocol, there are specific set of countries which can act as buyers, and there are specific set of countries which act as sellers. Now, any one country can be a buyer, and any one country can act as a seller. To that extent, therefore, we consider it as an improvement from the Kyoto Protocol. Markets rely on competition, and when you segregate a market into a buyer and a seller, obviously there will be limited competition. When anyone can be a buyer and a seller at any time, that will enhance competition, and that will enhance the outcome of any market conditions. But it is also problematic from the point of from the perspective of avoiding double counting, tracking movement of mitigation outcomes, as the term is used in the Paris Agreement. But here is our view: we shouldn't use a Kyoto mindset or a Kyoto framework to try to govern or understand the Paris Agreement, particularly as far as this international transfer of mitigation outcomes is concerned. For example, take Ethiopia. Ethiopia, as I have said, in its nationally determined contribution, has made it clear that it will use the market mechanism. And let's take Germany and assume that there is such a transaction between Ethiopia and Germany, such a transfer of mitigation outcomes. Now, for me, it's not really a problem that Ethiopia reports that as part of its compliance activities, and it's not a problem that Germany reports that as part of its compliance activities. It has nothing to do with the conditionality and unconditionality of the issue. From the perspective of compliance, that is not the issue. The issue is from the perspective of tracking overall global progress towards our temperature goal. From that perspective, yes, we should be concerned. We shouldn't be fooled by a picture that might emerge as a result of the fact that everybody is reporting mitigation outcomes, similar mitigation outcomes, or similar set of action. But from the perspective of compliance, since in the first place, for example, Ethiopia has made it clear in its INDC that it will use market mechanisms, I don't see any problem that Ethiopia reporting a certain project or program as part of its compliance activity, even if that same program is used by another country to report on its performance or compliance. I think the issue has to do with tracking global progress, and it has nothing to do with compliance. And secondly, in paragraph 2 of Article 6, the CMA is supposed to develop guidelines as far as market mechanisms and as far as internationally transferred outcomes are concerned. I think here it is important to make sure that those guidelines help for the linking of different market mechanisms, national market mechanisms and international market mechanisms, and a linking of the various national mechanisms. To the extent that market mechanisms are fragmented, I think that is also a reduction in the utility of the very mechanism, and therefore the issue of fungibility, which will come into picture when we talk about interlinkage, should be addressed. And most importantly, for countries such as Ethiopia, particularly as far as the sustainable development mechanism is concerned, I know that that's not how it is defined, but it is commonly used, sustainable development mechanism, in Article 6. As far as that mechanism is concerned, any procedures, modalities to be developed should be on the basis of the experience of our CDM, and they shouldn't represent any, they shouldn't put in place any kind of systemic barriers against some sectors, against some projects, and against some regions. Here is a challenge of trying to balance between efficiency on the one hand and distributional issues on the other hand. the experience of markets generally, and the CDM in particular, is such that some sectors, some projects, particularly smaller projects, and some regions are systematically excluded as a result of the procedures and rules, and we should find some way of balancing that. And another point is on sustainable development, the issue of sustainable development. That is expressly provided in Article 6, and that was also provided in the Kyoto Protocol. And in the Kyoto Protocol, as far as CDM is concerned, it is the host countries which decide on whether a certain project has enough sustainable development benefits for that country to approve it. And I'm expecting that a similar arrangement will be provided for the market mechanism established by the Paris Agreement. But we should also be mindful of this problem of race to the bottom, when everybody decides for itself whether a certain project has enough sustainable development benefits, but in the end, and at the end eventually, the aggregate sustainable development benefits emanating from a certain mechanism will not be enough because of this problem of race to the bottom. Therefore, there should be a mechanism of making sure that the race should be to the top. How can we put a system of rules and regulations in place so that those projects which have higher sustainable development projects are actually encouraged? And finally, the linkage between the market mechanism and the financial mechanism of the convention, as well as the Paris Agreement. The point is already mentioned, the fact that a certain procedure of international mechanisms should go to finance adaptation activities in developing countries. And another point is, how do you use the international as well as bilateral climate funds to make sure that there is no inflation of international mitigation outcomes when a certain market emerges as a result. For me, whenever there is, if we put in place a very strong international market mechanism, that could also serve as a way of tracking climate finance, or that could be also used as a way of discharging financial obligations by some countries. Therefore, linking climate finance and market mechanisms, in my view, will ensure that there is enough demand for any kind of internationally transferable mitigation outcomes, and that there is no inflation of such outcomes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Highlevel. Are there any questions in the room towards Mr. Highlevel's presentation at this point? Yes, there's one. Do we have a microphone? Thanks.
Thank you. I'm Christine Kaya. I come from Uganda, Parliamentary Forum on Climate Change. I am inquiring about the approach tracking the market mechanisms from the grassroots, or is it a top-down approach? How are you ensuring that it is bottom-up for inclusion of all, other than the government first suffering alone and including the locals later? Thank you.
Is there a way to answer that in a short statement, or should we take that to the discussion afterwards?
I think we could take that to the discussion afterwards.
Yeah. Requires probably some deeper thoughts, actually. Another question here.
Thank you, Jos Kozijnse from Defense Fund. Thanks for the presentation. A short informative question. Did you now say you can use the reductions twice for compliance, or did you say once for compliance, but you can report it twice? Both countries are reporting it for tracking. Just to be sure about that. Thank you.
I think the contributions are self-determined, right? And when we report our contributions, we said that we will use any kind of mechanism to make a 64% reduction in our emissions by 2030 from business as usual. Not self-contradictory to report that Ethiopia has complied with its contribution, relying from a certain market mechanism. We have similarly any other country which has transacted with us. If they report that, I don't see any problem. As I've said, the problem is that we shouldn't take that compliance reports by member states, and we shouldn't use that as an input, for example, to track the progress of the whole world on its temperature goal, because that would inflate the figure, and there should be an adjustment. But as far as that is a collective responsibility, right? As far as individual member states are concerned, personally, I don't see any problem. Thank you.
Okay. I think we can then move on to the last presentation. Looking forward to hear from our hosts, Tunisia.
It works? Okay, thank you. So hello everyone, and thank you for coming. So my presentation will be a bit more general than Article 6, but I think it can be a good introduction for a good discussion afterwards. So let me start by giving you a brief overview on the content of my presentation. So the first part will be devoted to the national context. The second one will focus on the main steps undertaken by Tunisia to get ready for climate finance. And then for the third part, on how carbon market mechanism can help achieving Tunisia's INDC goals. So for those who don't know Tunisia, it's located in the north of Africa, and its current population is around 11 million. Its area is 163,000 square kilometers, and the coastline is 1,148 kilometers. The desert area accounts for 40% of the overall territory, and the climate is Mediterranean in the north and coast, semi-arid in the inland, and Saharan in the south. So regarding the climate change issue, Tunisia ratified the UNFCCC in 1993, the Kyoto Protocol in 2003, and recently the Paris Agreement in October 2016. It shows Tunisia is implementing the UNFCCC guidelines through the submission of its national communication, 2 national communications, and the third one is currently under preparation. It also submitted its first BOR by the end of 2014, and the second BOR is under preparation too, and is supposed to be submitted by the end of this year. And Tunisia also submitted its INDC in September 2015. So according to the 5 national greenhouse gas inventory conducted in Tunisia, the greenhouse gases reached 47 million tons CO2 equivalent by 2012, with an increase of 2.7% per year over the period 1994 and 2012. The energy-related activities are the primary source of emission reduction in Tunisia, and accounts for 85% of the all emissions, which is the equivalent of around 27 million tons of CO2 equivalent in 2012. The per capita emissions are 3 tons CO2 equivalent, according to the last inventory in 2012. So this slide concerns the carbon intensity evolutions and shows a decrease in the carbon intensity by 1.5% over the period 1994 and 2012, and translates Tunisia's effort in terms of decoupling economic growth from carbon emissions. So besides the efforts made by Tunisia in terms of reduction in the carbon intensity, there's still a big mitigation potential that can be tapped. So being aware of that, Tunisia is currently exploring all the innovative ways to further improve its carbon intensity. And one possible way to explore is the climate finance. So the willingness to do so is reflected on the steps undertaken by Tunisia to get ready for climate finance. So the process undertaken can be summarized as follows. So first, Tunisia submitted its INDC. It tried to identify its priority sectors. And then now we are currently trying to identify also project portfolio and implementing an MRV system. In addition, within the frame of the INDC, we try to identify the funding needs the funding that we need to reach our INDC goals. So I'm going to come back one by one to all these steps to explain more the approach undertaken by Tunisia. So the Tunisian INDC objective is to reduce the carbon intensity by 41% in 2020, comparing to 2010. And Tunisia confirms its ambition goals through the ratification of the Paris Agreement. The main mitigation efforts should focus on the energy sector, which represents 75% of the total NDC goals, mainly through energy efficiency and renewable energy actions. Indeed, Tunisia committed itself to increase the renewable energy share in electricity production by 30% in 2030, and also to reduce the energy demand by 30% in 2030. Then we try to identify the priority sectors, which are the cement sector and the Tunisian solar plan, which represents together 45% of the total of the overall objective INDC objectives. So 30% for the TSP and 15% for the cement sector. Then now we are currently working on the identification of a portfolio of projects, mainly in the priority sectors. So for the cement sector, we are currently performing an energy and CO2 audits, which is supposed to allow us to identify specific actions and specific projects. For the Tunisian solar plan, we have a new law since May 2015, and we are currently waiting for the inaction and publication of the decrees to be able to identify a portfolio of projects too for this sector. Now I'm going to move to one of the more important building blocks for readiness for climate finance, which is the MRV systems. So the idea is to have a national MRV system for all the sectors, and to have a focus mainly on the energy sectors, and more specifically on the priority subsector, which are the cement and the Tunisian solar plan. So the idea is to have to adopt a bottom-up approach through the aggregation of subsectoral and sectoral MRV systems. We also identify the funding needs for supporting NDC, the NDC scenario for mitigations. And the funding needed are around $17 billion. 85% of the funding needs are for the energy sector. 1 billion euro, so 6% for the cement sector, and $8 billion for the cement sector, and $8 billion for the Tunisian solar plan. So this is the approach undertaken by Tunisia to get ready for climate finance. Now I'm going to focus more on carbon market mechanism as a potential source of international climate finance. So Tunisia expressed also its willingness to use carbon markets in its INDC, mainly on the priority sectors that I have already talked about. And the idea is to try to build on the carbon market experience, mainly through CDM, to pilot carbon market instruments through the PMR, Partnership for Market Readiness, and also to take into account the provisions of Article 6.2 and 6.4 under the Paris Agreement, and Article 6 of Paris Agreement. So the idea is to build on CDM experience and to consolidate and build the CDM gains like baseline definitions, emission factor calculation, and MRV, and to try to avoid the CDM gaps like the high transaction costs, the complex procedures, and the limited price visibility, the lack of CR demand. Second, it's worth mentioning that Tunisia is currently a member of the Partnership for Market Readiness, and the idea is to explore and then pilot the most suitable carbon market instruments with its national and economic circumstances. So the third point, is to take into account the provisions of Article 6.2 and 6.3 under the Paris Agreement. But as already discussed, we already know, everybody knows, that there is a lack of clarity on these articles. That's why Tunisia made a submission to the SABSTA in September 2016. In order to give its view on these articles, specifically Article 6.2 and 6.3. So for Article 6.2, activities under this article should follow a common international set of rules on MRV and accounting, including common criteria for baselines. And then for Article 6.4, the mechanism established should build on existing institutions, methodologies, and procedure and the Kyoto Protocol. We should build on the positive aspects of CDM, but simplify procedures and governance and limit transaction costs. And also one of the most important points is that the mechanisms under the Article 6.2 and 6.3 should operate with an evolutionary and dynamic floor price to set a long-term price signal. So to summarize, the work undertaken by Tunisia led to the identification of 2 priority sectors. These 2 sectors are the ones best suited for carbon market mechanism, since they are well-structured sectors. There's availability, we can get the information, so availability of information. The big mitigation potentials, together this sector represent around 45% of the overall mitigation potential and the INDC objectives. And we can implement a robust and accurate MRV system. So the carbon market mechanism can be a good opportunity to foster private sector participation in the efforts towards low carbon economy, to access new funding sources, to get additional funding and supplement international sources of climate finance, to develop new financial mechanisms, to improve profitability, and to help achieve the NDC goals. Thank you.
Thank you, Afif. Are there any questions for clarification on the input from Tunisia? Otherwise, I would encourage debate. I might actually start up with a few questions to the speakers myself, but feel free also to come up with provocative maybe or interesting questions for the wide range of issues that we have covered. I believe we have actually touched upon most, if not all, the key questions or open issues for negotiation, including already the question from the audience, how can we achieve implementation on the ground from a bottom-up, probably by having the private sector getting really engaged? How is this possible to be achieved also maybe in least developed countries or countries that have maybe also been disadvantaged in a way in the CDM? So these types of questions, of course, are on everybody's mind. And I would maybe actually start off with this question to the speakers. How would you answer that? How does the Paris Agreement market mechanisms starting point where we are offer an opportunity to make sure that this is possible? Would you like to start on the left?
Okay, I think, I think it depends on the kind of market mechanism that you are dealing with. One thing which is clear is that the Paris Agreement gives recognition to a number of possible market mechanisms, and it also establishes its own market mechanism, right? As far as all these regional, national, subnational market mechanisms which are recognized by the Paris Agreement are concerned, the role of the CMA seems to be very limited. That is that of providing guidelines so that there is no double counting, so that the adverse consequences of such a decentralized world would be taken care of. And as far as those diverse market mechanisms are concerned, tracking is a real challenge. Single currency or unit which is used. Therefore, that is a real to do the tracking as far as the market mechanism which is established by the Paris Agreement is concerned, because that is going to operate under the authority of the conference of the parties, and it looks like this, it follows the same. It has the same structural features as CDM. Therefore, it might be easier to track that market mechanism which is established by the Paris Agreement. But those which are given recognition, it's very difficult. Now, here is a challenge. On the one hand, you have a highly regulated international mechanism, and on the other hand, you have virtually unregulated but guided national and regional market mechanisms. Now, if these are going to be fungible, now the question is, why would a country or an entity go for a strictly regulated international mechanism when you have a room for a virtually unregulated but guided national and subnational mechanism? That is the issue of the challenge of the tracking. And on the other hand, also, I think markets, when they, I'm taught that markets, when they do good, when you have a very good market, it will result in a decline of price, right? As a result of competition, you will have a decline of price. But that's not what you wanted in carbon markets. What you wanted in carbon markets is an increase in the price of carbon. Therefore, really, you are not looking for a market mechanism, somehow an inverted market mechanism. Therefore, you should build in place, you should put in place safeguards, mechanisms for increasing over a period of time, for increasing the price of mitigation outcomes, because that is what serves the ultimate objective of the convention. Thank you.
Thank you. Afif, you already mentioned a few points, I believe, that would point towards that aim to really make sure that there is broad participation from countries that have also not maybe participated that much in the CDM, and maybe also towards upscaled action. What would be your maybe wish to the international community negotiating on market mechanisms, that initiatives such as the sector-wide credited NAMA in the cement sector would become a real action on the ground?
Thank you. So as I said, that we believe that carbon markets can be a good opportunity for Tunisia to reach its mitigation goals, and also to involve the private sector, provided that some clarification are given, mainly on how to guarantee that the emission reduction units, as already said, are similar, how to ensure environmental integrity, how to ensure also transparency, and maybe one recommendation is maybe to link the Article 6.13 with the Article 6.4 and Article 6.2 to guarantee transparency in the transaction of emission reduction units. And also, one of the main points, I think, how to avoid double counting, because as already raised by my colleague, if the emission reduction are used by the buyer for its compliance and for to demonstrate its INDC achievement, how the host country can account for this for emission reductions. We should avoid double counting, but maybe some kind of agreement need to be reached, because otherwise all the initiatives undertaken within the national context in terms of mitigation should be removed from the INDC if we use the carbon markets. So I think that some kind of agreement should be reached and clarification should be made, I think, especially on this point.
Thomas, I will give you this question in the most open sense, so you can choose how to answer it.
Yeah, thank you for this openness. There are many points. I would like to start with Afef's points. I think it's clear that the most challenging question for Tunisia is the upscaled activity, whether it's a NAMA or a sectoral mechanism or under 6462, it's open. The question is how to mobilize the partner side to get the financing. It's clear that Tunisia had worked for a long time for this sector, and it's really interesting to look into this activity because it's so crucial for the development of renewable energies in Tunisia and for energy efficiency in this sector specific. And it's clear it's a booming sector for a long time. So it would be really a key point for reaching the NDC. So the question is for me, how we can get programs that support really this broad activity. And I can answer only with this World Bank transformation carbon asset facility, which should start in a near time. We have launched it in Paris last year. The intention is to get broader programs in work. And we will have from side of the World Bank a factor from 1 to 4. They would like to underlie the investment with the 4 times of the incremental things coming from the carbon market. So we have the target of 500 million US dollars for the programs and expecting the finance from 2 billion. So maybe this is the way forward, but this money is not enough to put your sector on. So it's experimental in the actual phase, but this is the way forward. And I hope we can learn from this and also to ask how we could create these activities concretely here for Tunisia. And, you know, I expect that you have been in contact with the World Bank on this, and it's difficult to find the right programs which could move quickly forward. So for having a learning phase in the next years, we are looking for the projects or programs which could move forward directly. But this means, the national conditions which has to be prepared and also the readiness of the companies and the financing sector beyond it is important to mobilize. I hope we can make progress there in the next time. But it's clear the World Bank is providing not free money, it's providing out of their programs, so they can't print this. So we hope to combine this money for the carbon market with their capabilities in other programs. So that's also a challenge for countries like you to get into this financing schemes. But this is the answer. I think this is the only way to learn in the moment, which is open. And I expect that we share all activities there. And the other point is, you mentioned it, it has to be some regulations under 6.2 or 6.4 that it can have a future. So that's clear. And in my point, it's nice to have a NAMA, but it's so undefined. It doesn't make progress, and it comes out from earlier processes. I think the music is under Article 6 or directly under climate financing. So this is a way. And the other thing is, of course, in climate finance, the people are speaking about shifting the trillions. It would be helpful for you. So if there's a way of long-term finance or other things moving on, that would be crucial for such broad projects. So this is not the answer, but maybe the way where we can find it later. The other thing Margrethe has mentioned, and of course, I think it's in the recognition of the Article 6, many people think 6.2 is a free cooperation thing. It's not. Because we have to say guidance is nice, how to make it, and there's no international oversights. But we have to face our experiences, and we should learn from the Kyoto Protocol that there have been hot air with the assigned amount units, especially in Eastern Europe. And we would like to avoid the discussion about having weak NDCs and creating out of these new activities which has no ground. So we will discuss which activities, which scopes are eligible, and we would like to see not only the avoidance of double counting, we would like to clarify what it's accounted, what activity is in line with activities of the Paris Agreement. And so the discussion is up how we could align the linking of emission trading scheme, which is not so easy because the allowance does not represent any reduction. The whole system, the cap represented. And this is a difference we will make strongly against the cheap linking of emission trading schemes. I know that this is a position which is, many people are contradicting, especially from the ETS, because they have to make clear that not an allowance which has maybe at the end of the cap and trade period, hot air like in the EU, we have seen the recession from 2008, and it brings 2 gigatons of recession allowances in the game, not only the ugly CDM, CR projects, with, which has an influence, which has represented at a broad scale emission reduction. So let's compare it really on a rational thinking. There are the emission reductions, maybe not all are additional if you look for hydros or something in China, but there are a lot of activities in renewables which are new. And on the other side, you have the recession and set allowances free. So please bring it together. That's the one part. And where our countries have engaged really intensively for years because they don't like the CDM. I speak about our Japanese friends. They have done so many activities, so many explorations, try to get the first project running on a small scale to have the experience. And I don't see that it's easier to go this way. This maybe brings up the question how useful it is to go for small countries the 6-4 way, because all things are arranged. Maybe standardization of methodologies will help them, and it's clear we should not reinvent the complicated things. And I gave you absolutely right in the thinking that it could be this scenario I mentioned, but we have to avoid it to make clear it's not a free game under 6.2, and it has not to be again the complicated things with an executive board with maybe it's too strong on a political level. And we see the political level now, not maybe in the market mechanism, but on the questions of the NDCs and the stock taking on the general architecture of the Paris Agreement. Maybe this is something we have to learn, that the architecture is different and may ease our cooperation with Article 6. And you mentioned the scenario which should be avoided. So that's my answer for the problems we see in the moment.
Yes.
Thank you. So I totally agree with you on the fact that the TCAF, for example, the transformative carbon asset facility can be greater for opportunity for Tunisia, especially for crediting approaches. And in Tunisia, we're trying to define our mitigation program in a way that can suit for this kind of initiatives, because this initiative can put a price on carbon, can create demand, which is something that doesn't exist for the moment. And Also, the second point maybe is to try to have a more or less flexible mechanism in a way that if the crediting approaches are not very suitable for are not very feasible, maybe we can reach other kinds of funding, like, for example, the Green Climate Fund or the NAMA facility or other initiatives. So maybe also one other question in this sense is, which is not clear under the Paris Agreement, is to what extent we can combine different kind of fundings. For example, can we combine direct finance with carbon market finance, or is it allowed or not? So maybe it's something else that needs to be clarified.
Very good. I believe it's fair to open the room for questions entirely. So please feel free to show your hands if you want to pose a question to the podium. Can you? Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I want to thank all the panelists for their good presentation. My question is for Madame Hafaf from Tunisia. I am Tunisian, from civil society of Tunisia. My question is, Madame Hafaf, you mentioned that in your presentation that agriculture is the second sector which emitted carbon or house gas, and this emission is not taken on consideration in the indices of Tunisia. My question is why are you, and what is the strategy of Tunisia to reduce these types of emission? Thank you.
Actually, the agriculture, forest and agriculture was included in the NDC because there's a NAMA developed in Tunisia on agriculture. I'm not specialist in this field, but there's a NAMA which is developed with the Ministry of Forest and Agriculture, and it was taken into account when preparing the NDC. But in my presentation, I focused on the energy sector because it's the sector with the most important emissions and also with the most important mitigation potential. But it was considered.
I don't have anything to add because it was considered in our INDC, the emission from the agriculture, but adaptation on adaptation matters. Not all sectors were well covered in our INDC.
Thank you. You said give us provocative questions at the beginning.
Please.
So I would like to know, I'm Tunisian, Sharif Zaouch. We are very frustrated in Tunisia that it's very clever to go after the carbon, getting money back or getting finances out of what we don't do because we have lack of activities that we have something to sell. But we are very frustrated because how did you let go out of Tunisia a project that was meant to be in the Sahara, and now it's done in Morocco about the solar energy, and letting STEG, la Société Tunisienne d'Électricité et de Gaz, having the monopole on the solar energy, because that's terrible. If you privatize that sector, and many people, many young people will get through that potential that is immense in Tunisia, because we are a North African country and we have lots of sun. So I would like to know what's your answer. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So actually, a lot of work is being done in Tunisia regarding renewable energies, and we are struggling now in Tunisia to promote renewable energy. And we set the objective of having 30% of electricity production through the renewables, and it was adopted by the Tunisian government and also in the development plan of Tunisia of between 2016 to 2020. And as I said before in my presentation, we have a new law which is not the best law in the world. I I can confirm that, but I think many big steps has already been done, and we are trying to improve it. To try to involve the private sector, because the 30% I was talking about is mainly focused on the private sector. 80% of the Tunisian solar plan objective is based on the private sector. And for that, we need to have good laws on renewables that can allow private sector get into the market. For the moment, we made, I think, good steps, and we need to improve further.
May I react, Matthias? I'm turning the favor. It's your role as an NGO to help us face the stag and bring into reason and convince them that we need to have to explore and exploit. I don't know how to say that in English. The energy, the solar energy that we have in bunches. But also we are advancing slowly and surely. You know that we don't catch flies with anything but honey. And the stag, I'm sorry to say that we are trying to catch it with honey, with sweet words and bringing them to reason. So it's your turn to help us.
The lady in the back.
Thank you very much for the presentations. I have a question about the presentation from Ethiopia. And you mentioned the problem with the sustainable development and the potential problem of the race to the bottom. So what kind of idea is there to safeguard or to avoid that the sustainable development is overseen, like maybe sometimes in the CDM? And what role can private standards play? And I also want to remind, there was this question before about the bottom-up process from her.
Uganda. It's for you?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you very much for the question. I think the room for international regulation of that issue of sustainable development is very limited. Yes, you pointed out correctly that there is a significant room for private standard development, and also in our evaluation of internationally in our evaluation of mitigation outcomes, do we value mitigation outcomes equally, or are some mitigation outcomes more valuable than other mitigation outcomes? I think that will reverse this potential race to the bottom. Therefore, with an international sort of third-party standard development and giving value or valuing correctly those mitigation outcomes which have significant mitigation outcomes, I think that, in my view, would represent something in the right development.
Thank you. The bottom-up question. Is there anything to add on that? I mean, this is such a big question.
Yeah. On the, again, similarly on the bottom-up, many of the mitigation, the market mechanisms are going to be regional, national mechanisms, right? And therefore, the role that the CMA could play here is to provide for international guidelines on how to identify and track That's why when I was speaking about the absence of a unit, an international unit, I'm trying to highlight the difficulty of tracking initiatives, market mechanisms from the bottom up. But I still think that it's possible. And
yeah, I mean, if I try to interpret the different pieces that we heard from the different speakers also, I think we heard partial answers to this question of how to make sure the bottom-up implementation works. And that's on the one hand that the rules are simple enough that they can be put into work for the private sector, and that maybe we don't reinvent the wheel entirely, as Thomas put it. And yeah, ultimately, maybe, and that maybe leads to my closing question to the panelists, how to make sure there is sufficient trust on all sides, both for the private sector to actually get involved, to really have the credible perspective to mobilize a regular income from getting involved in the market mechanism, as well as for the countries looking to sell units, as well as for those that look potentially to buy units, maybe to strengthen their own NDC or to top up their NDC in a way. So the question there being really centrally, how to make sure in the short term, in the very next steps, that this trust can build up and that this trust can actually work as a catalyst to drive up ambition towards the overall objective of the Paris Agreement. And maybe I'll relate this question to the panelists now. What would be your maybe one or two key points that you would see are urgently needed to advance trust?
From my point of view, I think there's a need for clear rules, long vision, and price signal on the long term.
Wow. It's short and sweet. Very good. Thomas?
Have I something to add to these points? I don't know. I think it's really not the time to mobilize demand. It's too early, but the signals which are expected are these which have mentioned by Afef, and there are also some other points. There are so many items on the table which make life for companies difficult. It's not only the question of standardization and the pre-calculation of what you are doing, but it's also to question which regulations will come up if we see the discussion about sustainable development. If this is a sustainable development mechanism, as some parties mentioned, then we will get the question why it's up to the markets, why it's not up to the official development aid. And the question is really on the table. If you would like to see what is in the Paris Agreement, there is clearly formulated promote sustainable development. That's really a good point. It's more clear than under the CDM. And that means that the use of this mechanism should be in this direction. And why not using climate finance and the official development aid, how the private sector can come in, because the activities are selected by these programs. If we have a lot of activities in Germany to support the SDGs, why not asking how these new mechanisms could be integrated? I'm absolutely to have these regulations on a really public standard to bring it together, what we are financing, and for the companies to develop a voluntary standard, which is in the discussions now. But I absolutely accept the position of countries which are concerned by any international definitions found out in Europe, North America, Japan, to say this is what is sustainable development. This is something this is not going back. And we can discuss it in an academic sense. No, we have to take up the chances we have. This is already billions which is on the market. And to say promote means to be responsible what you are doing with your billion of money. Yeah. So this is a question also to the donor side. So I'm German, so I have also to put this question at home. That's clear. And it's not the question, how can you take this micro thing, this Article 6.4, which does not exist, to help the world for sustainable development in a situation where it's not clear that enough demand is created and no one is asking for, let's say, 100 gigatons of reductions in the next decade. Would be nice. Yeah.
I think as a final point, we should make sure that any kind of market mechanism or any kind of physical policies, whether carbon taxes or crediting or market trading mechanisms, shouldn't be taken as a permission to emit. And there is a real danger that it might be taken as a permission to emit. And particularly, as I've said earlier, if you have a market under normal circumstances over a longer period of time, it is supposed to result in the fall of prices. That is supposed to be the beauty of market mechanisms, right? But that is not what you are trying to do here. What we are trying to do here is to make sure that over a period of time, the price of carbon actually increases to make a real reduction of emissions. And that's where you should do much of the work. You should put in place safeguards for that to actually happen. If at some point in the future, if the price of carbon, for example, falls down, you shouldn't be surprised if you didn't do if you don't put in place the safeguards. That's where I think the issue of sustainable development, comes into picture. The issue of linking the financial mechanism with the market mechanism, and the issue of increasing demand. I think that's why many of the countries, for example, countries in Africa, where they are ambivalent or reluctant when it comes to market mechanisms, is that we are creating mechanisms after mechanisms when there is no evidence that there is a capacity to absorb such mechanisms. Therefore, I think it's time to act also on both sides of the question, both on the supply and the demand side of the market. Thank you.
And my answer, I'm going to be as short as Afif. From my experience, I learned that being honest brings people to listen to you and maybe to follow you in somewhere. Tell our private sector that there is no moon to catch there. There is work. There is a cooperative work to be done by everybody, and that we learn by doing at the end, and at the end, somewhere, you will get whatever you are looking for. Okay, that's a long term, but we have to get there. As Afif showed you, we have all the ingredients to have a market in Tunisia, but somewhere the magic potion doesn't work. Maybe what's going to happen here will bring us there and will make the recipe final. Maybe we will have a market. And then maybe a regional market like our colleague from Ethiopia talked earlier. We could start from there, a regional market at the level of Africa. Parenthesis here, I took a course on emission trading system a long time ago, and one of my questions was there a way that a market could be established between the ETS of Europe and, let's say, a national market in Tunisia? And there's no way it could be, and now we are in a situation that contradicts whatever he was thinking. And I believe that we could get there with a belief. Thank you.
Thank you very much. With this, it is my pleasure to thank our speakers for this very constructive and very inspiring discussion, and for sharing their thoughts on the market mechanisms going forward. And I'd like to thank you for your attention. And I wish you a good start into COP22. Hopefully the negotiations will be conducted in a similar constructive spirit and lead to good results. Thank you very much and have a good day.
Thank you.
know you are in contact with our friends from Perspective very often.